Around 90 million years ago, the oceans covered far more of the planet than they do today. Entire regions of land sat beneath shallow water, and a vast seaway once split North America into two. These waters were not distant margins, they were central, warm, and constantly active. Life filled every level at once. Large reptiles moved through open water, while dense schools of fish shifted beneath them, never settling for long. Some predators grew to sizes comparable to the largest marine hunters alive today, yet their behavior was far less stable. Evidence suggests they hunted each other as often as they hunted anything else. There was no fixed position at the top. Fossils show fish preserved with prey still inside them, bodies strained beyond what they could survive. Others carry bite marks from multiple species, layered into the same bone. Even successful hunts could end the hunter. Certain body forms appear in the fossil record that do not resemble anything living now. Long, narrow jaws, rigid shells coiled into shapes that seem inefficient, proportions that suggest speed, but not endurance. Some species appear briefly, then vanish without transition. Conditions allowed rapid growth, but not long stability. Oxygen levels shifted across regions, food sources expanded and collapsed in cycles that left little room for error. Survival depended on timing more than dominance. In this journey, we are returning to a Cretaceous ocean shaped by constant pressure and change. Welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. If you enjoy explorations like this, consider liking the video and subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. Alright, let us move into a world where ancient seas were filled with creatures that followed very different rules of survival. The shape of the world itself had settled into a quiet arrangement that allowed the oceans to spread far beyond their modern edges. Continents rested in positions that opened wide basins, letting seawater move inward and linger across low-lying land. Instead of sharp coastlines and deep boundaries, there were vast regions where land and sea blended into shallow expanses, warm and softly lit from above. These waters did not feel distant from the continents that framed them. They pressed gently into the interiors, forming inland seas that stretched across entire regions. One such body of water divided a great landmass into separate halves, its surface calm at times, then shifting with slow currents that carried life from one place to another. Shorelines were not fixed lines, but shifting margins, responding to subtle changes in sea level and sediment. The climate that held this world together remained steady for long stretches of time. Temperatures stayed high across much of the planet without the presence of large polar ice caps to lock water away. With more water free to circulate, sea levels rose and remained elevated, covering areas that would one day stand dry. This warmth reached into the oceans, creating layers of water that rarely grew cold enough to slow the processes unfolding within them. Sunlight filtered easily through these shallow seas, reaching depths that would otherwise remain dim. It carried energy into the water, feeding microscopic life that formed the base of a vast and expanding network. Nutrients moved through these environments with quiet persistence, stirred by currents and enriched by the land nearby. Rivers delivered minerals and organic material, blending with seawater to create conditions where growth could continue without interruption. In such places, life did not need to struggle against scarcity in the same way it might in harsher settings. Instead, it expanded outward, filling available space with increasing complexity. Small organisms multiplied rapidly, forming dense populations that supported larger forms above them. Each layer of life built upon the one below, creating a structure that could sustain a remarkable variety of creatures at once. The stability of the climate allowed these systems to develop over long periods, refining themselves through gradual change rather than sudden disruption. Species adapted to specific depths, temperatures, and conditions, finding narrow ranges where they could thrive. Over time, these specializations became more pronounced, shaping bodies and behaviors to match the environment with increasing precision. Water moved constantly through these seas, though often without urgency. Gentle currents connected distant regions, carrying organisms and nutrients across wide distances. What began in one area could influence another far away, linking ecosystems into a continuous living network. There were no clear separations, only gradients that shifted gradually from one condition to the next. In this setting, expansion felt almost inevitable. With warmth, light, and nutrients working together, life found opportunities in nearly every direction. Forms emerged that took advantage of open space, others adapted to the dense layers below, and still others moved between these zones with careful timing. The world had arranged itself into a foundation where growth could proceed with few immediate limits. Within these shallow, sunlit seas, the conditions for abundance were already in place, quietly shaping everything that would follow. There was no clear summit in these waters, no final tier where life could rest without pressure from above or below. Movement itself carried risk, and every position within the living network remained exposed to something larger, faster, or simply closer at the wrong moment. The idea of a fixed hierarchy dissolved here, replaced by a shifting pattern where advantage rarely lasted. Traces of this instability remain preserved in bone. Fossils carry marks that do not belong to a single encounter, but to many, layered into the same surface. Teeth from different species left their signatures in overlapping arcs and punctures, each strike recording a separate event. Some wounds show signs of healing, edges softened and reformed, suggesting that survival continued after contact. Others cut deeper, interrupting that process entirely, leaving behind a final imprint without recovery. These markings do not align with a simple chain of predator and prey. They reveal a more fluid exchange, where animals capable of hunting could themselves become targets under slightly altered conditions. Size alone did not grant protection. Larger bodies required greater intake, drawing them into frequent encounters where opportunity and danger were closely linked. A successful hunt could create vulnerability, slowing movement or narrowing awareness just enough for another presence to intervene. In this environment, timing carried as much weight as strength. A moment of distraction, a turn taken too late, or a shift in current that altered visibility could change outcomes in an instant. Speed offered brief control, yet it could not be sustained indefinitely. Energy reserves dictated how long an animal could remain in motion, and the need to conserve that energy often meant drifting into intervals of reduced vigilance. Awareness extended beyond sight alone. Subtle changes in water movement, pressure, and vibration traveled outward from every action. Creatures learned to read these signals, responding to disturbances that hinted at both opportunity and threat. Still, interpretation required precision. A signal that suggested prey could also indicate another hunter moving along the same path, drawn by identical cues. Encounters did not always end cleanly. Some bodies bear evidence of partial consumption, sections removed while the rest remained intact. This pattern suggests interruption, a feeding attempt abandoned due to interference or risk. Competition did not wait for completion, it pressed inward, forcing decisions that balanced gain against immediate survival. Even among the most capable hunters, interactions carried repetition. Healed injuries appear alongside fresh damage, indicating that conflict was not rare or isolated. It returned again and again, shaping behavior over time. Movements became more cautious, routes more variable, yet complete avoidance was never possible. The density of life ensured that paths would cross. Within this constant overlap, No position remained secure for long. The absence of a stable top did not create disorder, but a different kind of balance, one defined by continual adjustment. Each creature occupied a place that shifted with circumstance, rising or falling depending on the moment, rather than any permanent status. The ocean held all of this quietly, without distinction between dominance and vulnerability. It carried the traces of every encounter, preserving them in forms that would endure far beyond the lives that created them. Within certain stone layers, a peculiar stillness appears, as though a single moment refused to dissolve with time. A long body lies suspended in mineral form, its outline clear, its final act preserved with unusual precision. Inside it, another shape rests intact, aligned headfirst within the larger frame, as if movement had simply paused and never resumed. This is where the story of Xiphactinus emerges, not through motion, but through what remained when motion failed. Its form suggests speed and reach, a fish built for pursuit in open water, with jaws that extended forward and teeth shaped to secure rather than tear. It moved through its environment with the ability to close distance quickly, relying on sudden acceleration rather than prolonged effort. Yet the evidence held within these fossils points to a pattern that did not always end in balance. The prey found inside these bodies often approached the predator's own size, sometimes only slightly smaller, sometimes nearly equal in length. Such captures required a precise sequence of actions, the alignment of both bodies, and a commitment that could not easily be reversed once begun. The act of swallowing prey whole created a temporary transformation. The predator's body expanded around the captured form, its internal space stretched beyond its usual limits. This expansion altered buoyancy, shifted balance, and likely restricted movement at a critical moment. What had been an advantage during the chase became a constraint once the prey was secured. In several specimens, the outcome appears fixed at this exact stage. The predator did not resume its motion. There are no signs of digestion, no breakdown of the prey within. Instead, both forms remain as they were at the moment of capture, suggesting that the process ended abruptly. The reasons can be traced through the physical limits of such an event. A body extended too far, internal systems strained, perhaps even damaged, leaving no path forward. This pattern reflects more than a single miscalculation. It speaks to the conditions that shaped behavior in these waters, where competition pressed continuously from all sides. Opportunities to feed may have been brief, requiring immediate action without the luxury of restraint. When such moments appeared, hesitation carried its own cost, and so the response leaned toward excess rather than caution. The design of Xiphactinus supports this interpretation. Its jaw structure allowed for wide opening, its teeth positioned to prevent escape once contact was made. These features enabled it to secure large prey, but they also encouraged a strategy that approached the edge of its own capability. Each successful capture carried the possibility of imbalance, a narrow margin between nourishment and failure. Around these preserved moments, the broader environment remains implied rather than shown. Other hunters moved through the same spaces, drawn by similar needs, responding to the same signals. The presence of such competition may have shortened the time available to complete a hunt, increasing the pressure to act decisively and without delay. What remains in stone is not only the outline of two fish locked together, but the record of a system where survival often depended on choices made within seconds. In the case of Xiphactinus, those choices sometimes extended beyond what its body could sustain, leaving behind a quiet imprint of a hunt that reached its limit and could not return. A long silhouette moves through the water with a kind of measured certainty, its path unbroken, its presence altering the space around it without effort. It does not rush, yet distance closes all the same, carried by a body shaped for steady control rather than sudden bursts. The form belongs to a lineage that once lived on land, yet here it has fully given itself to the sea. These are the mosasaurs, marine reptiles whose ancestry traces back to creatures that walked on solid ground. Over time, their limbs transformed into broad paddles, their bodies lengthened, and their tails developed powerful extensions that guided them through open water. What remains of their origin is subtle, carried in the structure of their bones, but their function now belongs entirely to the ocean. Their jaws extend forward with a flexibility that allows for more than simple capture. Each side can shift slightly, accommodating prey that would otherwise resist entry. Teeth curve inward, designed to secure rather than slice, holding onto struggling forms until movement fades. This arrangement supports a feeding style that does not rely on breaking food apart, but on drawing it inward in large sections, sometimes whole. Within fossil remains, this behavior appears in quiet detail. Stomach contents reveal a wide range of prey, from fish to other marine reptiles, each preserved in varying states. Some remains show partial digestion, others remain more intact, indicating recent capture. These findings suggest that mosasaurs did not limit themselves to a narrow selection, but adapted their feeding to whatever opportunities arose within reach. Their size contributed to this flexibility. As some species grew larger, the number of potential threats decreased, yet it did not vanish entirely. The environment still required awareness, still demanded movement, still shaped behavior through constant interaction. Even so, their presence shifted the balance around them. Areas they occupied became defined by their movement as smaller creatures adjusted patterns to avoid contact when possible. The body of a mosasaur supported both endurance and control. Strong musculature along the tail provided propulsion, while the paddles stabilized each movement, allowing for precise changes in direction. This combination allowed them to navigate complex environments without losing efficiency, maintaining a pace that could continue over extended distances. Their rise within these seas did not happen suddenly. It unfolded across time, as earlier groups gave way to forms better suited to the conditions that persisted. Gradually, mosasaurs came to occupy roles that placed them among the most influential hunters of their environment. Their presence became more frequent in the fossil record, their remains appearing across regions that once held different dominant species. Alongside their physical adaptations, their distribution suggests an ability to move between areas with relative ease. They were not confined to a single type of habitat, but appeared in various marine settings, from more enclosed inland waters to broader open regions. This range allowed them to encounter a wider array of prey, reinforcing their position within the shifting structure of life. In the quiet record left behind, mosasaurs appear not as sudden intrusions, but as a steady expansion of capability. Their forms reflect a gradual alignment with the demands of the sea, each feature shaped by the need to move, to capture, and to continue. Within that alignment, they came to represent one of the most complete expressions of predatory life in these waters, carried forward by a design that rarely needed to hesitate. Along certain fossil surfaces, the pattern of damage does not follow the outline of a single encounter. The marks appear deliberate, spaced in ways that reflect repeated contact, as though one large body met another more than once, each meeting leaving a record that could not be erased. These impressions remain pressed into bone, quiet and enduring, shaped by forces that matched each other in strength. Among the remains of mosasaurs, such traces become especially clear. Deep grooves and punctures align with the size and arrangement of teeth from individuals of similar kind. The spacing does not suggest accidental contact or scavenging after death. It reflects direct interaction, where jaws closed against bodies still capable of movement, each strike part of a struggle that unfolded in open water. Some of these bones carry a second story, layered over the first. Around the edges of older wounds, the surface has changed, smoothed and thickened by the slow process of healing. New tissue formed over damage that did not end the animal's life, reshaping the bone into a slightly altered form. This recovery indicates that such encounters were not rare disruptions, but events that could be endured and survived, only to be faced again later. The presence of both healed and unhealed injuries within the same species suggests a pattern that extended across time. Large hunters did not exist in isolation. Their paths crossed, drawn together by overlapping territories and similar needs. When they met, the outcome was not always avoidance. There were moments when distance closed and neither form yielded, leading to direct contact that left its mark. These interactions were not driven by a single cause. Competition for food likely played a role, especially in regions where resources gathered densely. A captured prey item could attract attention, turning one hunt into a point of convergence for others nearby. In such moments, the focus could shift from pursuit to defense, from feeding to survival, as another presence entered the space. Territorial behavior may also have shaped these encounters. Areas that offered consistent access to prey or favorable conditions would have drawn repeated use, increasing the likelihood of overlap between individuals. When movement patterns intersected within these spaces, conflict became a possible outcome, not as a constant state, but as a recurring feature of life within a shared environment. The bodies of mosasaurs reflect an ability to endure such strain. Their skeletal structure supported powerful movement, yet it also carried the capacity to recover from damage that might have ended a less robust form. Healing did not erase the past, but it allowed continuation, carrying forward the memory of each encounter within the bone itself. In this setting, competition extended beyond the pursuit of smaller prey. It existed among the largest hunters as well, shaping behavior in ways that left visible traces long after the movements themselves had faded. Each mark, preserved in fossil form, represents a moment when balance shifted, when two paths converged and neither withdrew in time. What remains is a quiet accumulation of these moments, held within the structure of ancient bodies. They speak not of constant conflict, but of repeated intersections, where survival required not only the ability to hunt, but the capacity to endure encounters with others that hunted just as well. Some forms in the fossil record seem to turn away from symmetry, as if the quiet rules that guide most bodies were briefly set aside. Their outlines do not follow the familiar curves seen in living seas. Instead, they bend, coil, and fold in ways that feel uncertain at first glance, as though shape itself had become open to variation without clear restraint. Among these forms are ammonites, whose shells depart from the smooth spiral that defines their relatives. Rather than tightening into a balanced coil, their structures stretch into loops, twist into irregular arcs, or extend outward in segments that appear almost disconnected. These shells, often described as heteromorphic, carry a geometry that resists easy prediction. Each turn follows its own path, creating a silhouette that seems both deliberate and unstable. Despite this unusual appearance, these creatures remained part of the same broader lineage, sharing internal features that connect them to more familiar forms. Their chambers still arranged in sequence, their buoyancy still regulated through subtle adjustments within those compartments. The difference lay not in their basic function, but in how that function was expressed through structure. The reasons for such variation remain embedded in possibility rather than certainty. One interpretation suggests that these shapes influenced how the animal moved through the water. A tightly coiled shell supports a certain kind of balance and rotation, while a more extended or irregular form may alter drag, orientation, or stability. In some cases, the shell may have slowed movement, encouraging a drifting or hovering lifestyle rather than active pursuit. Another possibility rests in defense. An irregular outline could disrupt the expectations of a predator, making it harder to grasp or position within the jaws. Protrusions and bends might interfere with handling, increasing the chance that an attack would fail or be abandoned. Such advantages would not guarantee safety, but they could shift the outcome of an encounter in subtle ways. There is also the role of ecological space, where new forms arise, not because they are optimal in every sense, but because they fit into niches that remain unoccupied. In a system rich with opportunity, variation can persist long enough to be tested across generations. Some designs may offer slight benefits in specific conditions, allowing them to continue, while others exist briefly before fading from the record. The fossil layers reflect this pattern of appearance and disappearance. Certain shell types emerge with distinctive shapes, persist for a time, then vanish without leaving a clear line of transition. This rhythm suggests a process that moves quickly relative to the span of geological time, where experimentation unfolds across many forms at once. Within these variations, the concept of efficiency becomes less rigid. What appears impractical from a modern perspective may have aligned with conditions that no longer exist. The water, the distribution of life, and the pressures of interaction all differed in ways that allowed such designs to function, at least for a while. These ammonites do not represent errors or deviations in a simple sense. They reflect a broader capacity within life to explore structure, to extend beyond established patterns when conditions allow. Their shapes carry the quiet record of that exploration, preserved in stone as forms that once moved through a world where the boundaries of design were still unfolding. Nothing in these waters remained suspended for long. Every layer carried motion, sometimes subtle, sometimes immediate, but always present, threading through the entire system without pause. Even in moments that might appear calm from a distance, countless small movements continued beneath, each one contributing to a broader, continuous flow. Shoals of fish shifted in coordinated patterns, their bodies turning in near unison, responding to signals that passed through the group faster than any single individual could react alone. These formations did not hold a fixed shape. They expanded, contracted, and redirected, forming temporary structures that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Their purpose was not permanence, but responsiveness, a way to remain adaptable within an environment that rarely allowed stillness. Around them, larger forms traced wider paths, their movements less frequent but no less influential. As they passed through these shifting groups, the surrounding water responded, currents altering slightly, patterns breaking and reforming in their wake. The presence of a single predator could ripple outward, changing the behavior of many smaller organisms at once, creating waves of motion that extended beyond direct contact. This constant activity was not limited to visible interactions. Beneath and between these layers, other forms moved along their own trajectories, each following patterns shaped by feeding, avoidance, and the need to maintain position within a changing environment. Vertical movement played a role as well, with some species rising or descending through the water column, adjusting their depth in response to light, temperature, or the presence of others nearby. The absence of prolonged stillness meant that energy flowed continuously through the system. Movement required fuel, and fuel drove further movement. Organisms fed not only to survive, but to sustain the activity that allowed them to remain within the system at all. A reduction in motion often carried consequences, limiting access to food or increasing exposure to surrounding threats. Water itself contributed to this dynamic state. Currents moved through these seas with varying strength, redistributing nutrients and influencing where life gathered. Areas of convergence became dense with activity, while other regions thinned, only to fill again as conditions shifted. These patterns were not static, but part of an ongoing exchange that linked distant parts of the ocean into a connected whole. In such an environment, survival aligned closely with the ability to move effectively. Speed, agility, and timing determined whether an individual could navigate through this constant motion without falling behind or drifting into disadvantage. Yet movement was not always rapid. In some cases, efficiency came from conserving energy, matching the pace of surrounding currents, or maintaining position within a group that provided collective response. Even rest took on a different form here. Instead of complete stillness, it became a reduction in effort, a slowing rather than a stopping. Bodies remained in motion, carried by the water or by subtle adjustments that required minimal energy. This allowed continuity without interruption, keeping each organism connected to the flow around it. The sea, in this state, functioned less as a backdrop and more as an active medium, shaping and being shaped by the life within it. Every movement contributed to the next, creating a system where change was constant and stability existed only as a balance within ongoing motion. A sudden shift in direction can decide everything long before distance has time to matter. In these waters, movement is not only constant, it is precise, shaped by bodies that have been refined to respond without delay. Form and function settle into alignment, each curve and surface guiding motion through resistance that never fully disappears. Many of the creatures here carry a streamlined shape, narrowing toward the front and tapering behind, allowing water to pass along their bodies with minimal disruption. This design reduces drag, conserving energy while maintaining the ability to accelerate when needed. Smooth skin or tightly fitted scales contribute to this effect, creating a surface that does not easily catch or slow the flow around it. Beneath that surface, structure supports rapid force generation. Muscles run in organized segments along the length of the body, contracting in coordinated waves that travel from head to tail. This motion transfers energy efficiently, building momentum that can be released in short, controlled bursts. The tail becomes the primary driver, widening at its end to push against the surrounding water with greater effect. Fins and flippers add stability and direction. Positioned along the body, they allow for subtle adjustments during movement, preventing unwanted rotation and enabling quick changes in course. In some species, these appendages are rigid and supportive, while in others they remain flexible, adapting to shifts in speed or orientation. Together, they form a system that balances power with control, allowing movement to remain both fast and accurate. Speed itself is rarely sustained for long periods. Instead, it appears in brief intervals, moments where acceleration replaces steady motion. These bursts occur when distance must be closed quickly, or when separation becomes necessary to avoid contact. The transition from stillness to motion happens within fractions of a second, guided by neural pathways that convert sensory input into immediate response. Reaction time becomes as important as physical capability. The ability to detect change, process it, and act upon it without hesitation determines whether speed can be applied effectively. Visual cues play a role, but they are not the only source of information. Vibrations and pressure changes travel through the water, reaching sensory structures that translate these signals into awareness of nearby movement. Over time, these traits become more pronounced within populations. Individuals that respond more quickly, that accelerate with greater efficiency, or that maintain control at higher speeds tend to persist. Their characteristics pass forward, gradually shaping the form of future generations. This process does not aim toward a fixed ideal, but toward continued refinement within the conditions that surround them. Not all bodies follow the same path, yet many converge on similar solutions. Streamlining appears across different groups, as does the development of strong tails and stabilizing fins. These features emerge independently, guided by the same physical constraints and opportunities. Water resists movement in consistent ways, and life adapts accordingly. Within this environment, speed does not guarantee success, but it extends the range of possible outcomes. It allows approach and escape, pursuit and avoidance, each shaped by timing as much as by distance. The balance between energy use and immediate need remains constant, influencing when and how speed is employed. In the quiet record of form, these adaptations persist as evidence of a system where movement had to be immediate and precise. Bodies became instruments of response, tuned to a world where hesitation narrowed the path forward. Light does not settle evenly in these waters. It fades as it moves downward, softening shapes and blending edges until movement becomes the clearest signal left. Within this shifting brightness, vision takes on a particular role, not as a way to see detail, but as a means to detect change before it closes into contact. Many species here carry eyes that seem large in proportion to their bodies, positioned to gather as much available light as possible. The size alone suggests a need to capture faint signals, to extend perception into conditions where illumination is limited. These eyes do not rely on clarity in the way surface vision might. Instead, they are tuned to contrast, to the slightest variation in tone that separates one form from another. The structure within these eyes supports that function. A wide opening allows more light to enter, while sensitive layers at the back respond quickly to incoming signals. Movement becomes easier to detect than stillness, as shifting patterns stand out against a background that remains relatively uniform. This creates a form of awareness that prioritizes motion above all else. In such an environment, the ability to register even a small disturbance can determine the outcome of an encounter. A slight displacement in the water, a brief shadow passing across a field of view, or a change in brightness along a distant edge may all signal the presence of another organism. These cues arrive quickly and fade just as fast, requiring immediate recognition and response. The placement of the eyes also plays a role. Some species carry them along the sides of the head, expanding their field of view and allowing for detection across a wide arc. This arrangement reduces blind spots, making it more difficult for another creature to approach without being noticed. Others position their eyes more forward, narrowing the field but increasing depth perception, aiding in precise movement during pursuit. Light conditions vary not only with depth but also with time and water clarity. Particles suspended in the water can scatter light, creating a muted environment where visibility remains limited even closer to the surface. In these settings, vision must adapt to a softer, more diffuse illumination. The boundaries between forms blur, and detection depends on recognizing subtle differences rather than sharp outlines. Some species likely moved through areas where light was reduced further, either by depth or by the density of surrounding material. In these regions, vision still functioned, though in a different capacity. The emphasis shifted toward sensitivity, allowing the detection of faint signals that would be invisible under brighter conditions. This adaptation extended the range of environments where these organisms could operate effectively. Vision did not act alone, yet it remained a central element in how these creatures interacted with their surroundings. It provided a continuous stream of information, guiding movement, shaping behavior, and influencing decisions made within fractions of a second. Even when other senses contributed, visual input often initiated the response, setting the sequence into motion. Across different forms, this emphasis on sight appears again and again, expressed through variations in size, placement, and sensitivity. Each version reflects a response to the same underlying challenge, the need to detect and interpret movement within a medium that never fully reveals what it contains. In the quiet persistence of these adaptations, vision becomes more than a sense. It becomes a way of navigating uncertainty, allowing life to continue within conditions where clarity is never guaranteed and where awareness must remain constant. Stillness can exist within motion, held in place for just long enough to alter what follows. In certain parts of these seas, bodies remain nearly suspended, not drifting aimlessly, but positioned with quiet intent. The water moves around them, carrying faint particles and subtle shifts, yet they do not respond immediately. They wait within the flow rather than against it. Some predators appear to have relied on this approach, shaping their behavior around the element of surprise rather than sustained pursuit. Their bodies reflect this difference. Instead of long, narrow forms built for continuous speed, they often show broader proportions, with structures that support short bursts of force rather than extended movement. Fins or limbs are positioned to allow rapid acceleration from a near standstill, while the rest of the body remains stable until that moment arrives. Fossil positioning offers hints of this strategy. Certain remains are found in orientations that suggest minimal displacement at the time of burial, indicating that the animal may have been close to the seafloor or within denser layers of the water. This placement aligns with an approach that favors proximity to cover, where visibility is reduced and outlines become less distinct. In such conditions, concealment does not require complete invisibility, only enough disruption to delay recognition. Murky water provides an environment where this delay becomes possible. Suspended material softens the passage of light, reducing clarity and blending edges. Movement is still detectable, but only once it has already begun. For an organism positioned carefully within this setting, the moment of detection and the moment of contact can occur almost at once, leaving little time for reaction. The act itself unfolds quickly. A sudden extension of the body, a rapid opening of the jaws, and the surrounding space collapses into a single point of contact. Energy that has been conserved during stillness is released in a brief, concentrated motion. If successful, the encounter ends before it has fully registered within the wider environment. This approach differs from that of pursuit hunters, whose bodies are shaped for continuous movement across greater distances. They rely on tracking, adjusting course over time, and maintaining speed long enough to close the gap between themselves and their target. Their interactions extend across space, while ambush occurs within a confined moment, defined more by timing than by distance. Both strategies exist within the same system, each responding to the conditions available. Where open water allows for sustained movement, pursuit becomes effective. Where visibility is limited and structure provides cover, ambush offers an alternative path. These methods do not exclude one another entirely, yet they emphasize different aspects of the same underlying need. The presence of ambush behavior adds another layer to the interactions within these seas. It introduces uncertainty not only in motion, but in stillness as well. A region that appears calm may hold concealed forms, positioned with precision, waiting for alignment between proximity and timing. Over time, these strategies become embedded in form and behavior, shaping how different species occupy their environment. Some remain in motion, tracing wide paths through open space, while others settle into quieter positions, allowing the surrounding conditions to bring opportunity within reach. Within this balance, stillness becomes as deliberate as movement, each serving its role in a system where survival depends not only on how fast one can move, but on when one chooses not to. Depth did not always offer refuge. As the water extended downward, conditions changed in ways that quietly restricted what could continue there. The surface layers carried energy and exchange, but below them, the balance shifted, becoming less forgiving, shaped by factors that were not immediately visible. Oxygen, dissolved within the water, did not remain evenly distributed. In deeper regions, its levels could decline, sometimes gradually, sometimes more sharply, depending on circulation and the breakdown of organic material sinking from above. Without sufficient mixing, these lower layers became zones where respiration was more difficult, limiting the kinds of organisms that could persist for long periods. This uneven distribution created a vertical structure within the ocean, where life arranged itself according to what each layer could provide. Near the upper regions, where oxygen and other resources were more readily available, activity remained high. Below, the number of organisms decreased, and those that remained often showed adaptations that allowed them to tolerate reduced conditions, though rarely without constraint. Between these layers, boundaries formed that were not fixed lines, but gradients, shifting with changes in temperature, chemistry, and movement of water masses. These gradients influenced where species could exist, guiding their distribution through depth rather than across distance alone. An organism, adapted to one level, might struggle if it moved too far above or below its preferred range. Yet these layers were not completely isolated. Movement between them occurred, though often with purpose rather than ease. Some species traveled vertically as part of their routine, rising into regions where food was more abundant, then descending again to avoid interaction or conserve energy. This pattern allowed them to use multiple zones without remaining exposed in any single one for too long. Such movement required careful timing. Entering a layer with lower oxygen for too long could lead to physiological stress, while remaining in more active regions increased the likelihood of encounter. The balance lay in transition, using each layer for its advantages while avoiding prolonged exposure to its limitations. This behavior added another dimension to survival, extending it into depth as well as across horizontal space. The presence of oxygen pore zones also influenced how nutrients circulated. Organic material sinking from above would accumulate and decompose, further reducing oxygen levels in these deeper regions. This process reinforced the separation between layers, maintaining conditions that limited widespread habitation while still allowing specialized forms to exist. Over time, these patterns shaped the structure of entire ecosystems. Rather than forming a uniform environment, the ocean became stratified, with each level supporting its own set of interactions. Connections remained, but they were mediated by movement and adaptation rather than by continuous overlap. Within this arrangement, safety could not be assumed simply by moving downward. Depth introduced its own challenges, quieter but no less significant than those found above. The water grew less accommodating, and life adjusted accordingly, finding ways to navigate a space where survival depended not only on presence, but on knowing when to remain and when to move. Patterns begin to loosen when pressure allows variation to persist. In these seas, the familiar spiral does not always hold its form. It stretches, folds, and reconfigures into shapes that seem to drift away from a single rule, each one carrying a different balance between structure and function. These variations appear not as isolated anomalies, but as a steady unfolding of possibilities within a lineage already well established. Ammonites, long defined by their coiled shells, begin to diverge into forms that challenge expectation. Some extend their shells into elongated curves that no longer wrap tightly inward. Others develop bends and offsets, creating outlines that seem to pause and then continue along a new direction. These heteromorphic designs remain anchored in the same underlying construction, with internal chambers arranged in sequence, yet their external geometry shifts in ways that alter how they exist within the water. Buoyancy remains central to their survival. The chambers within the shell regulate position through the careful balance of gas and liquid, allowing the animal to rise or settle without constant effort. Changes in shell shape likely influenced how this balance behaved. An extended form may have distributed weight differently, affecting stability and orientation. Instead of rotating smoothly, such a shell might resist certain movements, holding a preferred angle that aligned with specific behaviors or environmental conditions. Defense may also have played a role in these transformations. A tightly coiled shell presents a predictable outline, one that can be grasped and manipulated by a predator with relative ease. In contrast, an irregular form introduces complexity. Protrusions, bends, and extended segments could interfere with handling, making it more difficult to secure a stable grip. This would not prevent attack entirely, but it might alter the outcome of an encounter just enough to matter. The appearance of these varied shapes reflects a period of rapid diversification. New forms emerge within relatively short spans of geological time, each exploring a slightly different approach to the same set of challenges. Some persist, their designs proving compatible with the conditions around them, while others remain brief, appearing and disappearing without leaving a direct continuation. This pattern suggests an environment that allowed experimentation to proceed without immediate constraint. With resources available and ecological space open, variation could be expressed more freely. Selection still acted, but it operated across a wider range of forms, permitting multiple strategies to coexist, at least for a time. Yet this diversity does not extend indefinitely. At the close of the Cretaceous, ammonites vanish entirely from the record. Their many forms, both conventional and unusual, end together, leaving no direct descendants to carry their designs forward. The reasons lie beyond their individual adaptations, tied instead to broader changes that reshaped the entire system in which they existed. What remains are the shells themselves, preserved across layers, each one a record of a particular expression within a lineage that once filled the oceans with variation. Their shapes do not point to a single solution, but to a process, one where form could shift and expand in response to conditions that no longer remain. In their quiet persistence within stone, these shells reflect a moment when structure was still open to exploration, when the boundaries of design extended outward in multiple directions at once, before settling again into absence. A narrow form slips through the water with little resistance, its outlines simple, almost understated compared to the heavier shapes that move around it. There is no external shell to interrupt its motion, no rigid spiral or extended curve. Instead, its structure lies within, hidden beneath soft tissue, a slender internal support that gives shape without slowing its passage. These are the belemnites, squid-like animals whose design favors speed and flexibility. At their core rests a solid internal element, often called a guard, which provided balance and alignment as the body moved. Around it, muscle and mantle formed a streamlined profile, allowing water to pass cleanly along its length. This arrangement reduced drag and supported quick, controlled movement through the surrounding medium. Their method of propulsion differed from many other forms. By drawing water into the mantle cavity and expelling it through a narrow opening, they generated thrust in short bursts. This jet propulsion allowed for rapid changes in direction, sudden acceleration, and the ability to retreat quickly when needed. The motion was not constant, but intermittent, each pulse carrying the body forward before the next contraction followed. Within this efficiency, there remained a quiet vulnerability. Without a protective external shell, their bodies were more exposed, relying on speed and awareness rather than physical defense. This made them frequent targets for a wide range of predators, from smaller fish to larger marine reptiles. Their presence within fossil assemblages often appears alongside the remains of those that fed upon them, suggesting a central role within the network of interactions. Evidence of their behavior can be found in the preservation of ink sacs, dark traces that remain within certain specimens. This feature indicates an ability to release a cloud into the water, creating a temporary disturbance that obscured visibility. Such a response would have provided a brief opportunity to escape, disrupting the perception of a pursuing predator just long enough to alter the outcome of an encounter. Despite these adaptations, their position within the system remained precarious. They existed in large numbers, moving through the water in groups or loose aggregations, their abundance supporting the needs of many other species. This density increased the likelihood of detection, even as it provided some measure of collective response through shared movement. Their role extended beyond their own survival. By feeding on smaller organisms and in turn becoming prey for larger ones, they connected different levels of the system. Energy passed through them, transferred from one form to another, maintaining the flow that sustained the broader environment. Their presence helped stabilize this exchange, even as individual lives remained brief. The balance they maintained was delicate. Speed allowed them to avoid immediate danger, yet it required constant energy, which had to be replenished through feeding. Any disruption to this cycle could shift their position quickly, reducing their ability to respond when needed. In this way, their design offered both advantage and limitation, shaped by the same conditions that supported their existence. Within the quiet record left behind, belemnites appear as a reminder that not all success is measured by dominance. Some forms persist by moving efficiently through narrow margins, adapting to a role that connects rather than controls. Their swift passage through these seas carried both opportunity and risk, held together by a balance that could not remain fixed for long. Mass gathers slowly in a body, added through time, shaped by steady intake and growth that extends beyond a single season. As size increases, presence changes. Movement displaces more water, outlines become more defined, and interactions shift in subtle ways. Larger forms occupy space differently, their scale influencing how others respond even before direct contact occurs. For those that reach greater size, certain advantages emerge. A larger body can deter some potential threats, making direct attack more difficult or less efficient. Muscle and structure provide resilience, allowing these animals to absorb impacts that might overwhelm smaller forms. In open water, their reach extends further, enabling them to engage with prey that would otherwise remain out of range. Their presence alone can alter the behavior of surrounding life, creating small zones of adjustment wherever they move. Yet, this expansion brings its own demands. A larger body requires more energy to sustain itself, and that energy must be acquired regularly. Feeding becomes not just an occasional act, but a continuous requirement, shaping movement and increasing the need to locate sufficient resources. Gaps between successful hunts carry greater consequences, as the reserves that support such mass diminish more quickly than they can be replaced. Smaller animals follow a different path. Their bodies require less energy, allowing them to persist on more limited intake and to navigate environments where resources fluctuate. They can adjust direction with greater ease, change depth or position without the same expenditure, and respond more quickly to immediate changes. This flexibility allows them to occupy spaces that larger forms might pass through without noticing, using variation itself as a form of stability. Their reduced size also influences how they interact with risk. While they may be more vulnerable in direct encounters, they are less likely to draw attention at a distance. Their movements can remain subtle, their presence less pronounced, allowing them to pass through areas of higher activity without becoming a focal point. In groups, this effect can amplify, as collective motion creates patterns that are harder to isolate. Between these two paths, neither offers complete security. Larger animals, despite their strength, remain dependent on a steady flow of energy and can become exposed when that flow is interrupted. Smaller ones, though adaptable, must constantly navigate the presence of those that can overpower them if contact occurs. Each strategy balances advantage against limitation, shaped by the same environment that supports both. The fossil record reflects this balance through the range of forms that appear and persist. No single size dominates entirely. Instead, a distribution emerges, with different scales occupying different roles, each contributing to the overall structure of life within the ocean. This variety suggests that success is not defined by a single approach, but by how well a form aligns with its immediate conditions. Over time, these alignments shift. Changes in resources, movement patterns, or environmental structure can alter which sizes are favored in a given moment. What once provided advantage may become less effective, while other forms rise to meet new conditions. This constant adjustment prevents any one strategy from remaining sufficient on its own. Within this shifting balance, size becomes one element among many, shaping possibility without determining outcome. It offers potential, but not certainty, existing within a system where survival depends on how each form meets the demands placed upon it. Across the center of a vast landmass, water once stretched in a long, continuous band, separating regions that would later join again. This inland sea did not resemble the distant margins of an open ocean. It settled into the continent itself, forming a corridor of water that connected distant coasts while remaining shaped by the land on either side. The western interior Seaway extended over low terrain, its depth modest compared to the deeper basins beyond. Because of this, sunlight reached much of its volume, creating conditions that supported steady biological activity. The water remained warm, influenced by the broader climate, and this warmth allowed life to persist without the interruptions that colder regions might impose. Its boundaries were not fixed in the way coastlines appear today. Subtle changes in sea level and sediment altered its edges over time, causing the shoreline to advance or retreat across wide areas. These shifts created a landscape where water and land met in gradual transitions, forming habitats that varied from open stretches to more enclosed zones shaped by nearby terrain. Within this setting, life developed in ways that reflected both openness and constraint. The Seaway connected to larger oceans, allowing movement of organisms into and out of its waters, yet its inland position created conditions that differed from those external regions. Salinity, temperature, and nutrient flow could vary along its length, producing a range of environments within a single connected system. The shallowness of the seaway contributed to a richness that extended through multiple layers. Light penetrated deeply, supporting primary production across broad areas. Nutrients, delivered from surrounding land and circulated within the water, sustained a network of organisms that filled available space with consistent activity. Fish, invertebrates, and larger predators all found roles within this structure, interacting in patterns shaped by both abundance and competition. Sediment played a quiet but important role in preserving what occurred here. Fine particles settled to the bottom, gradually covering remains and protecting them from complete decay. Over time, these layers built up, recording details of life that might not have been preserved in more turbulent environments. As a result, the Western Interior Seaway now provides one of the most detailed windows into this period, with fossils that reveal both form and interaction. The creatures found within these deposits reflect a blend of influences. Some resemble those from open marine settings, having entered through connections that linked the seaway to larger bodies of water. Others appear more specialized, adapted to the particular conditions that existed within this inland system. This combination creates a record that is both familiar and distinct, showing how life adjusted to a setting that was neither fully isolated nor entirely open. Movement within the seaway followed its length as much as its depth. Organisms traveled along this corridor, encountering different conditions as they moved, adjusting to gradual changes rather than abrupt boundaries. This continuity allowed for exchange, while still maintaining variations that shaped behavior and distribution. In its quiet span across the continent, the Western Interior Seaway formed a unique environment where warmth, light, and connection combined in a particular balance. It did not simply mirror the open ocean, nor did it remain entirely separate from it. Instead, it existed as its own system, carrying within it a record of life that reveals how conditions can shape, form, behavior, and the traces that remain long after the water has withdrawn. Hunger does not arrive as a single event here, but as a steady presence that moves alongside every action. It shapes direction, timing, and choice, guiding bodies through water that offers opportunity in brief, shifting intervals. Food exists throughout these seas, yet it is rarely held in place long enough to be relied upon without effort. Competition emerges not only from scarcity, but from density. Many forms depend on the same sources, moving through overlapping spaces where encounters become unavoidable. A single concentration of prey can draw multiple hunters within moments, each responding to the same signals, each attempting to secure what is available before it disperses or is taken by another. Hunting, in this context, becomes a repeated act rather than a singular event. Attempts occur often, sometimes with little separation between them, as organisms adjust their behavior to match the pace of opportunity. A missed capture does not allow for extended recovery, as the conditions that produce the chance may not return in the same form. Movement continues, guided by the need to locate the next opening. Energy sits at the center of this pattern. Every motion, whether swift or gradual, draws from reserves that must be replenished. Larger movements require greater expenditure, while smaller adjustments conserve energy but may limit access to distant opportunities. Each organism navigates this balance differently, choosing when to act and when to hold position based on immediate conditions and internal state. The search for food is not evenly distributed across time. Instead, it unfolds in pulses, shaped by the behavior of prey and the environment that carries them. Schools may gather briefly, creating moments of abundance that dissolve as quickly as they form. Vertical shifts bring organisms into new layers, opening access for a short period before they descend again. These patterns create windows where feeding becomes possible, followed by intervals where it becomes more difficult. Within these windows, timing becomes critical. Arriving too early may mean waiting without result, while arriving too late may leave nothing to pursue. The ability to detect and respond to these changes determines how often an organism can successfully feed. Sensory awareness, movement, and decision all converge within these brief spans, shaping outcomes that affect survival over longer periods. Not all attempts succeed, and the cost of failure accumulates. Energy spent without return must be replaced through future success, creating a continuous cycle where each action influences the next. Over time, behavior adjusts to reflect this pattern, favoring strategies that align with the rhythm of availability rather than any single approach. Some forms may follow prey more actively, maintaining close proximity and responding quickly to shifts in direction. Others may position themselves where prey is likely to pass, reducing movement while increasing the chance of encounter. Both approaches exist within the same system, each shaped by the same underlying need to balance effort and reward. The environment itself contributes to this dynamic, carrying nutrients and organisms through currents that redistribute resources unevenly. Areas that are rich in one moment may become sparse in the next, requiring constant adjustment. No single location provides lasting certainty, and so movement remains tied to the ongoing search. Within this continuous process, feeding becomes less about individual success and more about persistence across many attempts. Survival depends not on a single capture, but on the accumulation of enough moments where opportunity and response align, allowing energy to flow forward through time. Bone carries memory in a quiet, physical way. It records not only the shape of a body, but the moments when that shape was disrupted and then slowly restored. In certain fossils, the surface is uneven, marked by thickened ridges or altered contours where damage once occurred. These features are not random, they are the result of healing, a process that unfolded over time while the animal continued to live. Some specimens show fractures that did not end the life they interrupted. The break is visible, yet it is bridged by new growth, a dense accumulation of bone that reconnected what had separated. The alignment is not always perfect. In some cases, the healed structure bends slightly or thickens unevenly, reflecting the conditions under which it formed. Despite this, the organism endured, adapting to the change as it moved forward. Other remains carry punctures or gouges that match the form of teeth from another creature. Around these marks, the surface has smoothed and hardened, indicating that the injury was not immediately fatal. Tissue regenerated, sealing the wound and reinforcing the area. This suggests that encounters between predators did not always end in loss, but could leave lasting traces that shaped the body without ending its function. These signs of recovery offer a view into behavior that is not captured by intact skeletons alone. An individual that survives injury must continue to move, to feed, and to navigate the same environment that produced the damage. This implies a capacity to adjust, to compensate for altered structure or reduced efficiency. Movement may have changed, speed may have been affected, yet survival continued. The process of healing itself required energy and time. Resources that might otherwise support growth or reproduction were redirected toward repair. During this period, vulnerability may have increased as the body balanced the demands of recovery with the need to remain active. That such healing occurred at all indicates that conditions allowed for at least temporary stability, enough to sustain life through the recovery process. Patterns of injury appear across different species, suggesting that these events were not isolated. They form a quiet record of repeated interactions where conflict, escape, and endurance intersected. Some individuals show multiple healed wounds, each one layered over the last, indicating a sequence of encounters that extended across their lifetime. These accumulations reflect a world where risk was ongoing, yet not always final. Broken structures that reformed, surfaces that repaired themselves, and bodies that adapted to change all point toward a resilience embedded within these organisms. This resilience was not absolute, but it was sufficient to allow continuation in many cases. It reveals a balance between fragility and persistence, where damage could be absorbed and integrated rather than ending the process entirely. Within the broader system, these healed injuries contribute to an understanding of how life functioned beyond moments of capture or escape. They show that survival was not defined only by avoiding harm, but also by enduring it. Each mark, preserved in bone, represents a passage through difficulty, carried forward into the structure of the body itself. Over time, these traces remain, long after the movement and interaction that created them have faded. They offer a form of continuity, connecting moments of disruption with the ongoing presence of life that followed, held quietly within the mineral record. Change can gather quietly and then become visible all at once, not because it began suddenly, but because the record only reveals certain moments. In these seas, new forms appear in the fossil layers with a sense of immediacy, as if they entered fully shaped, carrying features that had not been present in the strata below. The transitions that led to them are often absent or incomplete, leaving behind a pattern where emergence seems abrupt. This impression reflects a pace of evolution that moved swiftly under the conditions present at the time. Stable climates, consistent temperatures, and long periods without major disruption created an environment where specialization could develop with relative freedom. Organisms adapted closely to particular niches, refining their structures and behaviors to match the specific demands of their surroundings. Such specialization encouraged diversification. As different parts of the environment offered distinct opportunities, populations began to diverge, each following a slightly different path. Over time, these differences accumulated, producing new species that occupied narrow roles within the broader system. The result was a landscape of life where variation expanded rapidly, filling available space with forms that were finely tuned to their conditions. Many of these forms appear only briefly in the fossil record. They emerge, persist for a limited span, and then disappear without leaving a clear continuation. This pattern suggests that not all adaptations proved sustainable over longer periods. Some designs aligned well with the immediate environment, yet remained sensitive to even small shifts in conditions. When those shifts occurred, these specialized forms could not adjust quickly enough to persist. The fossil record captures these moments as isolated intervals, where presence is followed by absence without gradual decline. This does not necessarily reflect sudden extinction in every case, but rather a combination of factors that limit preservation and continuity. Changes in habitat, competition, or environmental chemistry could alter the conditions that once supported a species, leading to its reduction or disappearance. At the same time, other lineages continued, adapting to new circumstances or maintaining flexibility that allowed them to persist through variation. This contrast between short lived forms and longer lasting ones illustrates the balance between specialization and adaptability. While specialization offers efficiency within a stable context, it can also reduce the capacity to respond when that context changes. The environment itself played a central role in shaping this dynamic. With conditions remaining relatively consistent for extended periods, there was space for experimentation to occur across multiple directions. New forms could establish themselves without immediate pressure to revert or merge back into earlier patterns. This allowed for a proliferation of designs, each exploring a different aspect of what was possible within the system. Yet this same stability also set the stage for vulnerability. When changes eventually arrived, whether gradual or more pronounced, the system contained many forms that were closely tied to specific conditions. The disappearance of these conditions led to a corresponding loss of the forms that depended on them. Within the layers of stone, this process appears as a sequence of appearances and vanishings, a rhythm that reflects both creativity and limitation. Evolution moved with a quiet intensity, generating diversity that was both expansive and, at times, fleeting, shaped continuously by the environment that supported it. Invisible gradients run through the water, shaping where life gathers and where it fades. They cannot be seen in outline or color, yet their presence defines the limits of movement and the distribution of organisms across space. Chemistry, carried in dissolved form, becomes a quiet architecture that organizes the ocean from within. Oxygen does not remain constant throughout these seas. Its concentration shifts from one region to another, influenced by circulation, temperature, and the breakdown of organic matter. In areas where water mixes freely, oxygen remains more available, supporting active communities that rely on steady exchange. In other regions, where movement slows or layering prevents mixing, oxygen declines, creating conditions that restrict what can persist. These variations form zones that differ not in appearance, but in capacity. Some areas sustain a wide range of organisms, allowing complex interactions to unfold. Others narrow that range, favoring only those forms that can tolerate reduced conditions. Between them lie transitions, gradual changes that guide movement rather than halt it, encouraging organisms to adjust their position in response to shifting chemistry. Nutrients move through this system alongside oxygen, carried by currents and released through processes that recycle material from one level to another. Where nutrients accumulate, growth follows. Microscopic organisms respond first, multiplying in numbers that form the base of larger networks. This increase supports higher levels, drawing in fish and predators that depend on these concentrations for sustenance. The distribution of nutrients is uneven, shaped by both external input and internal cycling. Material delivered from land enriches certain regions, while deeper layers contribute through the slow return of elements that have settled below. Upward movement of these nutrients, driven by currents or changes in water structure, can create localized areas of high productivity where life gathers in greater density. At the same time, not all regions benefit equally from this exchange. Areas with limited circulation may remain nutrient poor, supporting fewer organisms and reducing the intensity of interaction. These contrasts create a patchwork within the ocean, where some zones are active and densely populated, while others remain sparse and quiet. The combination of oxygen availability and nutrient distribution determines where different species can exist. Some require higher oxygen levels to sustain their metabolism, while others can persist in lower concentrations but depend on specific nutrient conditions. These requirements guide their placement within the ocean, aligning each form with the environment that best supports its needs. Over time, this alignment becomes more precise. Populations adapt to particular chemical conditions, refining their tolerance and efficiency within those ranges. This specialization strengthens their position within certain zones, yet it also limits their ability to move freely beyond them. Boundaries form not as barriers, but as gradients that become increasingly difficult to cross. In this way, the ocean becomes structured by chemistry as much as by physical form. Habitable regions expand where conditions allow, while uninhabitable or less favorable zones persist alongside them. Movement between these areas remains possible, but it requires adjustment and, often, constraint. Within the quiet influence of these gradients, life arranges itself according to what the water can provide. The patterns that emerge are not fixed, but they are shaped continuously by the chemistry that flows unseen through every part of the sea. Constraints shape life by narrowing what can persist, yet there are moments in Earth's history when those constraints loosen, allowing forms to extend beyond patterns that later become familiar. In these seas, the boundaries that would eventually define modern ecosystems had not fully formed. Space, both physical and ecological, remained open in ways that permitted a broader range of possibilities to unfold. The absence of certain groups that dominate today created gaps that could be occupied by other lineages. Without these established competitors, emerging species encountered fewer restrictions on how they could develop. This did not remove pressure entirely, but it altered its direction, allowing variation to explore forms that might later be limited or excluded. Within this openness, traits could extend into configurations that seem unusual when viewed from a modern perspective. Body shapes diverged, feeding strategies expanded, and structural designs shifted without being immediately constrained by more specialized competitors. The environment still guided these changes, yet it did so across a wider field where multiple solutions could exist simultaneously without immediate displacement. Ecological roles were not yet tightly defined. Instead of fixed positions, there were gradients and overlaps, areas where different forms could occupy similar functions without direct exclusion. This flexibility allowed species to experiment with how they interacted with their surroundings, adjusting behavior and structure in response to opportunities that might not persist in a more crowded system. The pathways of evolution during this time reflect this freedom. Lineages branched into directions that would not all continue, yet each branch represents a response to conditions that permitted exploration. Some forms developed features that aligned closely with specific niches, while others maintained broader adaptability, moving between roles as conditions shifted. This expansion of possibility did not imply stability. While the absence of certain constraints allowed diversity to increase, it also meant that many forms existed within a system that could change in ways they were not prepared to meet. The same openness that supported variation also created conditions where specialization could lead to vulnerability if the environment shifted. The record of these seas shows a richness of design that reflects this balance. Multiple forms appear that share underlying connections yet differ in outward expression, each one representing a different approach to survival within the same broader system. These differences do not resolve into a single dominant pattern, but remain distributed across the environment, interacting in ways that maintain overall complexity. Over time, as new groups emerged and conditions evolved, these open spaces began to narrow. Competition increased, roles became more defined, and the range of viable forms shifted toward those that could persist within a more structured system. The earlier period, with its wider possibilities, gradually gave way to arrangements that more closely resemble those seen today. What remains from that earlier state is a sense of how life responds when limits are less rigid. It expands outward, testing variations that may not endure, yet contribute to the overall process of change. Each form carries within it a response to an environment that allowed it to exist, even if only for a time. In this way, the seas of that period reflect a moment when evolutionary pathways extended in many directions at once, shaped by conditions that offered space for exploration before the boundaries that would later define life became more firmly set. Change does not always arrive with sudden force. It can begin as a quiet adjustment, almost indistinguishable from the patterns that came before it. In these seas, the first signs were subtle, carried through small shifts in temperature and circulation that did not immediately disrupt the broader system, yet slowly altered the conditions that sustained it. The warmth that had remained consistent began to vary across regions. Some areas experienced slight cooling, others retained their heat, creating differences that had not been present before. These variations influenced how water moved, adjusting currents that once flowed with steady predictability. As these movements changed, so too did the distribution of nutrients and oxygen, introducing new gradients into an environment that had long maintained relative balance. Sea levels responded in parallel, though not always in a single direction. Gradual changes in global conditions caused the boundaries between land and water to shift once more. Shorelines advanced or withdrew, altering habitats that had supported stable communities. Regions that were once shallow and expansive became more confined, while others opened briefly before narrowing again. These adjustments reshaped the spaces where life had developed, forcing organisms to adapt to new configurations. Within this evolving structure, the first signs of strain began to appear. Patterns of movement that once aligned with predictable conditions became less reliable. Areas that had consistently provided resources fluctuated, sometimes offering abundance, other times falling quiet. This inconsistency required constant adjustment, placing additional demands on species already shaped by specific environmental ranges. Some organisms responded by shifting their position, moving toward regions where conditions remained closer to what they required. Others, more specialized, found it difficult to relocate or adapt. Their dependence on narrow ranges of temperature, chemistry, or habitat limited their ability to adjust when those ranges changed. As a result, their presence in the fossil record begins to thin, not abruptly, but gradually, as fewer individuals persist over time. These early disappearances do not always form clear boundaries. Instead, they appear as fading traces, where a species becomes less frequent in successive layers before vanishing entirely. This pattern reflects a process that unfolds over extended periods, shaped by cumulative effects rather than a single event. Each small change contributes to a broader shift that alters the system as a whole. The interactions between species also begin to shift. As some forms decline, others adjust their behavior or expand into newly available spaces. This creates a reorganization within the ecosystem, where relationships between predator and prey, or between different levels of the food network, take on new forms. The balance that once defined these interactions becomes more fluid, influenced by the changing conditions that surround them. Despite these changes, the system does not collapse immediately. Life continues, adapting where possible, maintaining function even as its structure evolves. The ocean remains active, its layers still connected, its processes ongoing. Yet beneath this continuity, the direction has shifted, setting in motion changes that will continue to unfold. In this early phase, the signs are quiet but persistent. Temperature, sea level, and distribution of resources all begin to move away from their previous state, creating a new set of conditions that will shape what remains and what cannot continue. Far above the atmosphere, a fragment of rock followed a path that had been set long before it neared the planet. Its motion remained steady until it met resistance, and then everything changed within a span too brief to leave gradual traces. The entry itself released energy that spread outward in waves, compressing air, igniting heat, and transforming motion into force that reached the surface with overwhelming intensity. When it struck, the interaction between rock and earth produced effects that extended far beyond the point of contact. Material was displaced, lifted, and thrown outward, forming a plume that carried dust and debris high into the atmosphere. The immediate surroundings experienced pressure and heat that altered the landscape in an instant, yet the broader consequences unfolded across much larger distances. Particles suspended in the atmosphere began to spread, forming a layer that reduced the passage of sunlight. This change did not occur uniformly, but it reached across wide regions, altering the amount of energy that entered both land and sea. With less light penetrating the surface, temperatures began to shift, and the processes that depended on consistent illumination were disrupted. Within the ocean, these changes influenced the foundation upon which the system depended. The smallest organisms, those that relied on light to sustain their activity, experienced a reduction in the energy available to them. As their numbers declined, the layers above them felt the effect. Organisms that fed on these primary producers encountered reduced supply, and this reduction moved upward through the network, altering interactions at every level. Water chemistry responded as well. The introduction of material from the atmosphere and from disturbed regions of the surface altered the composition of the ocean in subtle but significant ways. Changes in temperature and circulation influenced how oxygen and nutrients were distributed, creating new patterns that differed from those that had previously supported stable conditions. For larger organisms, the effects were indirect but no less consequential. The disruption of lower levels in the system reduced the availability of food, increasing competition in an environment already shaped by constant demand. Hunting attempts became less predictable in outcome as prey populations shifted or declined. Movement patterns changed in response as species adjusted to new distributions of resources. The collapse of food chains did not occur as a single event, but as a sequence of adjustments that reduced the connections between levels. Each loss or decline altered the balance, weakening the structure that had once supported a wide range of interactions. As these connections diminished, the system lost its ability to sustain the diversity that had defined it. Some regions may have retained pockets of stability for a time, where conditions remained closer to previous states. Within these areas, life continued, though under increasing pressure. Elsewhere, the combined effects of reduced light, altered chemistry, and shifting temperatures created environments that could no longer support the forms that had once thrived there. The ocean, which had long maintained a dynamic balance, entered a phase where that balance could not be sustained in the same way. Processes continued, but their outcomes differed, guided by conditions that had been reshaped by an event that unfolded in moments, yet carried consequences that extended far beyond its brief duration. A dimming settled across the surface, not as a sudden night, but as a sustained reduction in light that lingered beyond any natural cycle. The particles lifted into the atmosphere remained suspended, forming a barrier that filtered the sun's energy before it could reach the water below. What had once been a steady exchange between light and sea became uneven, then diminished. With less sunlight penetrating the surface, the upper layers of the ocean began to cool. This change did not happen all at once, but it progressed steadily, altering the thermal structure that had supported consistent patterns of movement. Warmer layers contracted, and cooler conditions spread, influencing how water mixed and how organisms distributed themselves within it. The reduction in light carried immediate consequences for the smallest forms of life that depended on it. Plankton, which had formed the base of the system, experienced a decline as the energy required for their growth became limited. Their populations decreased, not uniformly, but across wide regions where the reduction in light was most pronounced. This shift removed a foundational element that had sustained multiple levels of interaction. As plankton declined, the effects moved outward through the system. Organisms that fed directly on them encountered reduced availability, leading to changes in their own populations and behavior. These adjustments did not remain isolated. They extended upward, influencing predators that depended on those intermediate levels for sustenance. Each step carried the influence of the one below it, creating a chain of response that connected distant parts of the system. Cooling waters further shaped these changes. Temperature influences metabolic rates, affecting how organisms process energy and how quickly they must feed to maintain balance. As conditions cooled, these rates adjusted, altering the pace of activity and the demand for resources. Some species may have found temporary alignment with these changes, while others, adapted to warmer conditions, faced increasing difficulty. Circulation patterns also shifted under these new conditions. Differences in temperature influenced how water moved, redistributing nutrients and oxygen in ways that diverged from previous arrangements. Regions that once supported steady productivity became less reliable, while others experienced brief changes that did not persist long enough to establish stability. Within this altered environment, the connections that once held the system together began to weaken. The flow of energy from one level to the next became less consistent, reducing the ability of the system to sustain its previous diversity. Interactions that had relied on predictable availability of food and stable conditions were disrupted, leading to further adjustments across multiple species. The ocean did not become empty, but its structure changed in ways that reduced its complexity. Some forms continued, adapting where possible, while others diminished or disappeared as the conditions they required could no longer be maintained. The balance between different layers shifted, reflecting the reduced input of energy and the altered pathways through which it moved. In this prolonged dimming and cooling, the ocean entered a state where the processes that once supported abundance were constrained by the limits imposed from above. Light, which had driven so much of the system, remained filtered, and the consequences of that reduction continued to unfold through every level of life within the sea. Connections began to thin long before they disappeared. What once moved steadily from one form of life to another no longer followed the same paths, and the continuity that had supported countless interactions started to fragment. The ocean still held motion, still carried organisms through its layers, yet the structure beneath that movement had changed in ways that could not be easily restored. Key species, those that had anchored entire portions of the system, declined and then vanished. Their absence did not remain isolated. Each loss removed a point of stability, altering how other organisms found food, avoided danger, or maintained their place within the environment. These changes spread outward, influencing relationships that had once seemed consistent across time. Predator and prey no longer met within the same patterns. Some hunters encountered fewer opportunities, their movements extending further with less return. Others found themselves without the pressures that had shaped their behavior, altering their own interactions in response. The balance that once allowed these exchanges to continue became uneven, shifting with each absence that followed. As these relationships weakened, the larger forms that depended on them faced increasing difficulty. Marine reptiles, which had occupied prominent roles within the system, began to disappear. Their size and specialization, once aligned with stable conditions, now became limitations. Without the consistent flow of energy through the system, they could not sustain the demands of their own bodies. The decline of these larger animals did not occur in a single moment, but through a sequence of reductions that reflected the changing environment. Individuals became fewer, then rare, and finally absent. Their disappearance left spaces within the ocean that were not immediately filled, altering the overall structure of life in ways that extended beyond their own presence. Other groups experienced similar patterns, though not always with the same visibility. Some persisted briefly in isolated regions where conditions remained suitable, while others vanished more quickly as their requirements could no longer be met. The cumulative effect of these losses reshaped the system, reducing its complexity and altering the pathways through which energy and interaction flowed. The ocean itself continued, its physical form unchanged in the immediate sense, yet the life within it no longer followed the patterns that had defined the Cretaceous. What remained was a system in transition, moving away from its previous state towards something not yet fully established. The connections that had once linked its layers into a cohesive whole had been disrupted, leaving behind fragments that no longer aligned. In this state, the end of the Cretaceous ecosystem did not appear as a single boundary, but as a gradual unraveling. Each loss contributed to the next, each change reducing the system's ability to maintain itself in its earlier form. The processes that had supported diversity and interaction remained, but they operated within a diminished framework. Over time, this altered structure would give rise to new arrangements shaped by the conditions that followed. Yet within the layers that preserve this moment, there remains a clear transition where the continuity of one world gives way to the beginnings of another, marked by the quiet disappearance of what once filled the seas. Causes rarely stand alone, and here they gather into a single direction that unfolds across time rather than in a single moment. The event that altered the surface initiated a sequence, but it was the combination of changes that followed which determined what could continue and what could not. Each factor, taken alone, might have been absorbed, yet together they reshaped the conditions that had once supported a wide range of life. The initial disruption altered light and temperature, but its effects extended further through the system. As these changes moved through the ocean, they interacted with existing patterns, modifying circulation, chemistry, and the distribution of resources. The environment that had once provided consistency began to shift in multiple ways at once, creating a new set of conditions that differed from those to which many species had adapted. Adaptation requires time, and in this case, the pace of change exceeded the ability of many organisms to respond. Species that had developed under stable conditions often carried specialized traits, refined to match specific ranges of temperature, oxygen, and resource availability. These traits offered efficiency within that context, yet they limited flexibility when the context itself began to change. The dependence on stable ecosystems became a central factor in determining survival. Many organisms were not only adapted to their physical environment, but also to the presence of other species that formed part of their daily interactions. When those connections weakened or disappeared, the effects spread outward, influencing behavior, feeding, and reproduction. The loss of one element could disrupt several others, creating a network of change that extended beyond any single cause. Food availability declined as the foundational levels of the system were altered. The reduction in primary producers limited the energy entering the system, and this limitation moved upward through each level. Predators encountered fewer opportunities, while prey populations shifted in response to changing conditions. This reduction did not always occur evenly, but it was sufficient to alter the balance that had once sustained complex interactions. For larger and more specialized forms, these changes carried greater consequences. Their energy requirements remained high, yet the supply became uncertain. Without consistent access to food, maintaining their size and activity became increasingly difficult. At the same time, their ability to adjust to new conditions remained limited, constrained by traits that had once been advantageous. Smaller or more adaptable organisms found ways to persist, adjusting their behavior or occupying new spaces as conditions evolved. Their flexibility allowed them to respond more quickly, maintaining a presence even as the broader system shifted. This contrast highlights how different strategies influenced survival, with adaptability becoming more important than specialization under changing conditions. The disappearance of these creatures reflects the interaction of multiple pressures acting together. It was not a single event, but a convergence of factors that altered the environment beyond the range that many species could tolerate. Each change contributed to the next, creating a sequence that reduced the capacity of the system to support its previous diversity. Within this process, the end of these forms becomes part of a larger pattern where life continues but in a different arrangement. The conditions that once allowed them to thrive no longer exist in the same way, and so their presence fades, leaving behind a record of a world shaped by both stability and the limits of adaptation. What remains after loss is not emptiness, but a quieter continuation shaped by what could endure. In the altered waters, forms that required less, that could adjust more easily to shifting conditions, began to persist where others could not. Their presence was less imposing, less defined by size or specialization, yet it carried a resilience that aligned with the new environment. Smaller species found ways to navigate the changes with greater flexibility. Their lower energy demands allowed them to survive on reduced resources, and their broader tolerances enabled them to exist across a wider range of conditions. Where larger organisms had depended on consistent supply and stable interactions, these smaller forms adapted to variation, adjusting behavior and movement as circumstances shifted. Among them were early representatives of lineages that would later become more familiar. Fish with structures that supported efficient movement and varied feeding strategies began to occupy spaces left open by the disappearance of more specialized forms. Their designs allowed for both precision and adaptability, enabling them to respond to the uneven distribution of resources that now defined the ocean. The rebuilding of ecosystems did not occur as a rapid return to previous complexity. Instead, it unfolded gradually, beginning with the simplest connections and extending outward over time. Primary producers re-established themselves where light and nutrients allowed, forming the foundation for new networks of interaction. From this base, additional layers developed, each one depending on the stability of those below. As these layers formed, Relationships between species took on new patterns. Predator and prey interactions resumed, though often in different configurations than before. The absence of certain groups allowed others to expand into roles that had once been occupied, reshaping the structure of the system. This process created a new balance, distinct from the one that had preceded it, yet built from the same fundamental principles. Movement within the ocean continued to influence this rebuilding. Currents carried organisms into new regions, enabling the spread of species that could adapt to a range of conditions. This dispersal supported the gradual expansion of life across areas that had been disrupted, allowing ecosystems to reconnect over time. The pace of recovery varied across different regions. Some areas regained activity more quickly, while others remained limited for longer periods. These differences reflected the uneven nature of the changes that had occurred, as well as the varying ability of species to adapt to local conditions. Over time, however, the overall pattern moved toward increasing complexity as more connections formed and stabilized. Within this emerging system, the foundations of modern ocean life began to take shape. The balance between adaptability and specialization shifted, favoring forms that could respond to change while maintaining efficiency. This shift influenced the direction of evolution, guiding the development of lineages that would continue into later periods. The ocean, though altered, remained a space where life could reorganize and expand. What survived did so not by resisting change, but by aligning with it, finding ways to persist within conditions that no longer resembled those of the past. From this persistence, a new structure emerged, carrying forward the continuity of life in a form that would shape the seas to come. Over long stretches of time, the water did not return to what it had been. Instead, it settled into new patterns, shaped by the forms that persisted and the conditions that followed. The structure that emerged carried echoes of earlier systems, yet its balance differed in ways that would become familiar to the present. As recovery continued, certain groups expanded into roles that had once been held by others. Fish diversified further, developing forms that supported efficient movement and varied feeding strategies across a range of environments. Their bodies reflected a balance between speed, control, and adaptability, allowing them to occupy both open water and more structured regions with increasing effectiveness. Alongside them, other lineages rose into prominence. Early marine mammals would eventually appear, though their origins lay beyond this immediate transition. Sharks and bony fish refined their positions, becoming more central within the network of interactions. Their presence contributed to a system where dominance was less concentrated in a few large reptiles and more distributed across multiple groups. The balance between predator and prey shifted as these changes unfolded. Instead of a structure defined by a small number of very large hunters, the system moved toward a broader distribution of roles. Predation remained constant, yet it was spread across different scales, with many species contributing to the overall dynamic rather than a few dominating it. This redistribution influenced how energy moved through the ocean. With more varied pathways, the system became less dependent on specific connections. If one link weakened, others could support the flow, creating a form of stability that differed from the earlier arrangement. The interactions remained complex, but they were organized in a way that allowed for greater resilience under changing conditions. Body forms also reflected this shift. While diversity remained high, the more extreme designs that had appeared earlier became less common. Shapes tended toward configurations that balanced efficiency with adaptability, avoiding the narrow specialization that had once allowed for rapid diversification but also increased vulnerability. This did not eliminate variation, but it guided it into patterns that could persist over longer periods. Habitats continued to vary, yet the overall structure of the ocean began to resemble what is seen today. Layers remained, gradients in chemistry and temperature persisted, and movement continued to shape distribution. Within this framework, species arranged themselves into roles that aligned with these conditions, forming ecosystems that maintained continuity across time. The absence of certain earlier groups created space, but it was filled in ways that reflected the new balance, rather than recreating what had been lost. Each lineage that expanded did so within the constraints of the environment that had been reshaped, contributing to a system that was both connected to its past and distinct from it. As this process continued, the ocean settled into a configuration where adaptability held greater importance than extreme specialization. The forms that thrived were those that could adjust to variation, maintaining their place within a system that no longer supported the same range of possibilities as before. What emerged was not a return, but a transition into a different expression of life within the sea. The patterns that formed during this time would continue to develop, shaping the oceans into versions that, while still changing, carry a structure that can be recognized across the present day. From a distance, patterns begin to settle into view, not as fixed conclusions, but as quiet continuities that run through every shift described so far. The ocean of that time did not follow rules that remain unchanged. It reflected conditions that guided life into forms suited to a particular moment, and then moved on as those conditions altered. Adaptation, often understood as a solution, reveals itself here as something more temporary. Each structure, each behavior, each advantage existed within a narrow range of circumstances that allowed it to function. When those circumstances shifted, even slightly, what had once been effective could lose its place. The same traits that supported survival in one period could limit it in another, showing that adaptation is not an endpoint, but a response tied closely to its environment. Dominance, too, carried this same impermanence. The largest hunters, the most specialized forms, and the systems that supported them all appeared stable when viewed within their own time. Yet their presence depended on a network of conditions that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. When that network changed, their position could not be maintained, and their prominence faded without leaving a direct continuation. The environment itself emerges as the central force shaping these outcomes. Temperature, chemistry, movement, and the availability of light and nutrients worked together to define what was possible. Life did not shape these conditions in a lasting way. Instead, it responded to them, aligning with the opportunities and limits they presented. This relationship created a dynamic where change in the environment led to change in life, and those changes carried forward into new configurations. Within this framework, life appears less as a collection of fixed forms and more as a continuous process. Species arise, expand, and disappear, but the underlying patterns persist, guided by the same principles that have operated across long spans of time. The details vary, the forms differ, yet the interaction between environment and adaptation remains consistent. The record left behind shows how quickly these shifts can occur relative to the existence of individual species. What seems stable within a shorter span can give way when viewed across longer intervals, revealing transitions that reshape entire systems. This perspective softens the idea of permanence, replacing it with a sense of ongoing change that does not settle into a final state. Even the rebuilding that followed reflects this continuity. The forms that persisted did so not because they were stronger in any absolute sense, but because they aligned more closely with the new conditions. Their success was not guaranteed beyond that moment, only sustained for as long as those conditions remained within their range. In this way, the world of those seas offers a quiet understanding of how life moves forward. It does not progress toward a fixed goal, nor does it hold onto a single configuration. Instead, it adjusts, reorganizes, and continues, shaped by forces that extend beyond any individual form. What remains is not a single lesson, but a pattern that repeats across time. Life changes with its environment, and the forms it takes are reflections of the conditions that surround them. As those conditions shift, so too does the structure of life, carrying forward the same process in ever changing forms. There is a quiet distance now between that ocean and the one that exists today, a span of time that has softened its edges yet preserved its presence in fragments of stone and pattern. What once unfolded across those waters belongs to a moment shaped by conditions that no longer align in the same way, a convergence of warmth, space, and long stability that allowed life to take forms rarely seen again. Those seas held possibilities that emerged not from randomness, but from the precise balance of their environment. Wide, shallow regions, consistent temperatures, and abundant resources created a setting where variation could expand in many directions. Within that setting, life explored structures and strategies that matched the opportunities available, producing forms that appear unfamiliar when viewed from the present. Each creature carried within it a response to that world. The length of a jaw, the curve of a shell, the movement through water, all reflected conditions that supported such designs. What might seem unusual now was once aligned with a system that made it workable, even effective, within its own time. Their forms were not anomalies, but expressions of a specific environment operating under its own rules. As that environment changed, the forms it supported could no longer persist in the same way. The conditions that had allowed such diversity shifted, and with them the range of possibilities narrowed and redirected. What followed was not a repetition, but a transition into new arrangements that built upon what remained. Yet the traces of that earlier world continue to endure. Layers of sediment hold the outlines of bodies, the impressions of movement, and the evidence of interactions that once filled those waters. These records do not recreate the full experience of that ocean, but they provide a continuity that links past and present, allowing its patterns to be observed across time. The oceans that exist now carry their own balance, shaped by conditions that differ from those of the past. Their systems reflect a different set of constraints and opportunities, producing forms that feel familiar within the context of the present. Even so, they remain part of the same broader process, where life and environment continue to influence each other in ongoing cycles of change. Seen in this way, the ocean is not fixed to a single state. It has taken many forms across Earth's history, each one defined by the conditions that existed at that moment. The version known today is only one arrangement within that sequence, shaped by its own combination of factors that may one day shift again. Within the quiet record left behind, there is space to consider which forms linger most clearly in memory, whether a shape, a movement, or a pattern of interaction that stands apart from what exists now. These reflections do not alter the past, but they extend its presence, connecting it to the present through attention and curiosity. The story of those seas continues in this way, not through direct continuation, but through the understanding that the patterns of life are always in motion. What has been observed here is one chapter within a much longer sequence, inviting a continued exploration of how the planet's history unfolds through the traces it leaves behind.